So first, I'm very happy to meet you, David, and all the others in the audience. I'm very sad I can participate physically there, and I would like to thank the invitation for Anna for this conference, for this workshop. Although, okay, first I start with the presenter disclosure that I have no financial conflict of interest of any. And I would like to start my presentation with some remarks on my own perspective. I'm not a specialist in data management or data ethics. And as I see, the whole workshop presenters have some pioneering initiatives in this new data management world. What I'm just lagging behind the issues, but what's happening around here, and I'm working as a researcher on research integrity and research ethics, and as such a person, I know some of the issues, some of the ethics issues that are presented related to this. I do some ethics review for the EU grants on Horizon Europe program. I was former member of the Hungarian Central Research Ethics Committee, where we already had some discussions on data management and data sharing. And currently, I'm doing consulting work for the WHO headquarters secretariat, ERC, which is the Research Ethics Central Research Ethics Committee for the WHO. And actually, in this position was the first when I had first professional discussions on how to embed the new data management policies and open science policies into our work, or what should be our committee stance on this. And why it happened? Because in 2022, the WHO published its new policy on data sharing. The policy is titled the Sharing and Reuse of Health-Related Data for Research Purposes via the WHO Policy and Implementation Guidance. The policy document aims to clarify data sharing requirements within WHO. And also it requires to update existing practices and procedures within the research environment of the WHO. And as such, it affected the Research Ethics Committee work also. Basically, this policy document follows the FAIR principles that are known by most of us. That the main elements of this policy related to appropriate data repositories, digital object identifier usage, accurate metadata requirements that enables research replication, the use of data availability statements, descriptions of meta records, metadata records, and the policy lists some repositories that should be used by WHOs, and describes appropriate user agreements between data users. I don't want to go and comment the details of this policy. I just wanted to raise that how we, as the Research Committee Secretariat, came and see this issue, that we should do something with the role of our committee in responsible data sharing. So our first question in the committee was whether there are guidance documents or good practices or published experiences on Research Ethics Committee role in responsible data sharing. And I did a very superficial database research on academic literature related to this, and what I found that there's not really substantial discussion emerged on the role of research ethics committees in responsible data sharing, research ethics committees are often mentioned, but these commentaries are very broad and very general. The ethical issues of data sharing are extensively discussed globally, especially as it relates to genomics data and clinical trial data. But much less discussion surrounds health science data or social science data. And for example, in our research ethics committee at the WHO, very few clinical trials are evaluated or going through the ethics review procedures. Most of the studies that we are reviewing are health science research and using behavior science or social science methodologies. So what I found is very few papers focused on the specific issues faced by research ethics committees in reviewing protocols with a data sharing component. What I found that there is a general agreement that responsible data sharing is finding a right balance between openness and privacy, but less clarity on the procedures and formal criteria of conducting such ethical deliberations within a committee setting. Some of the international guidance documents address the issue of data sharing, like CIOMS guidelines, but in very, very broad terms. There's less guidance on if and how research ethics committees should review the effectiveness of access processes or ensure researchers actually share their data. One paper that I found and that have some concrete suggestions, recommendations, and messages on research ethics committee work was a systematic review on norms and principles of data sharing. It was published in 2019. At the end of the presentation, I will provide my biography or references that I'm using. So this paper provides an overview of principles and norms that are considered inherent to a governance framework for responsible data sharing. Qualitatively analyze the content of 31 international academic publications and 10 guidelines. In most sources, review and approval procedures by an independent research ethics committee or comparable review body play an important part in discussions about responsible data sharing for health research. This is very important, I think, because here this highlights the fact that most of the international guidelines and most of the discussion that occurring see some kind of role for research ethics committees, but very few specify what type of roles they see for such bodies. Some sources state that research ethics committees or comparable body must review and approve every study using collected data. The paper contains two useful tables, which are developed here on ethics review and informed consent. For ethics review, they suggest the following items that the research ethics committee should focus on. The one is whether the consent given is sufficient for the planned use in the research. Committees should determine when to seek reconsent. Use of data on the basis of broad consent. Research ethics committees seek the justification of a waiver of informed consent is provided or not. Usage of data not anticipated in the original informed consent process should be looked for. Reuse in cases where informed consent may not have been obtained previously. Whether the consent procedure meets the specifications of broad informed consent, whether explicit informed consent is required, whether informed opt-out procedures can be used. So summarizing this up, the ethical review should focus mostly on informed consent-related issues. So this is where more elaborate discussions occurred, and this is where research committees have some support or have some idea what our existing experiences are. There are some other things that I found suggested for ethical review. One is that the proposed usage or collections and the storage protocol, if other measures need to be taken to protect the donor, the use of personal identifiers, its necessity and how confidentiality will be protected, and whether individual counseling is necessary when returning genetic findings. There was another interesting paper that were really focusing on the specific issues of research ethics committee role in data sharing. This paper was focusing specifically on clinical trial data and was published in 2017 by Knoppers and Thorogood. The paper intends to cover all the major issues that RECs could face in extending their task to the assessment of data sharing component of proposals. Highlights the added responsibilities and tasks for research ethics committees, extension of ethics review and oversight, and mentions REC's lack of resources and lack of expertise in data protection and privacy. These two things that they found and they highlight, I think, really considerable aspects of data sharing and the role of research ethics committees, because most of the research ethics committees are already overburdened by administrative procedures, and this requirements on evaluating the data sharing component of proposals would extend their responsibilities quite radically in some cases. And most of the ethics committee members don't have the training and knowledge for evaluating appropriately data protection and privacy issues as are related to data sharing and data repositories and anonymization techniques and so on. In a lot of committee members, traditional research ethics committee members lack, I think, the terminology and the words that are used in this new world of data. Going back to this paper proposes that research ethics committees can enable responsible data sharing by assessing data sharing plans, ensuring appropriate consent language is used, and coordinating with other oversight bodies to reduce gaps of application in research oversight. Core topics are discussed in detail: assessment of data sharing plans, consent coordination, accountability, and oversight practices. On data sharing plan evaluation, RECs could evaluate data sharing plans when assessing a study's benefits. RECs needs to understand the basics of access governance. Privacy risk mitigation should be assessed, and RECs should be familiar with organizational best practices and best practices for coding or anonymization for clinical trials data. And I think these are the skills that are not there in most of the research ethics committees. And I'm sure they were not there in the committees that I've been working in. And most of my colleagues in Europe that I'm usually talking about these issues, they are not really professional in these type of knowledges. So related to data sharing plan evaluation, research ethics committees should ask whether the researchers commit to a timeline for sharing, whether the researchers or the repository clearly define who may have access, what conditions must the user or researchers agree to. Access should also respect norms of procedural fairness. Are access decisions made by an independent body? Are reasons provided for refusal to grant access? How RECs can contribute to oversight of data sharing? So RECs can ensure researchers specify a data sharing plan at the outset as part of the protocol. They ensure data sharing plan is adequately described during the consent process. If consent is requested for broad, unspecified future uses, then consent process should address how privacy, confidentiality, and access will be governed. Ensure researchers make a public statement about data sharing intentions. Data sharing plans could, for example, be registered along with trials. Then it would be an added task for research ethics committee member to check whether this registration occurred or not. They ensure investigator responsible for managing data or submitting data to a repository is identified. Ensure information about who has access to data and what it is used for is made publicly available. This requirement has dual function of ensuring data from the clinical trial is made available in a responsible manner and providing transparency over reuse practices. Extend continuing review to ensure data is made available. Report a failure to carry out the data sharing plan to relevant parties, and review the data sharing track record of sponsors and researchers when assessing the feasibility of data sharing plan, and withhold approval of all sponsors in breach of data sharing obligations to carry out additional trials until previous data is shared. So if I want to summarize this list of contributions that is required from an ethics committee to foster responsible data sharing, that is a lot of activities that, practically speaking, is highly challenging to fit into the regular work of current committees. There's also another issue that might be challenging. It's the coordination issue. So how the coordination between oversight bodies could be harmonized or established. So there are data access committees are newly established that are specific governance mechanisms on their databases. There are other oversight bodies, for example, research funding organizations have an oversight role on the research that they are funding, and sometimes they have monitoring activities and approval procedures. Also, there are repositories who have authority to oversight, and the different research ethics committees. And also, just if you focus on the research ethics committees on a global level, there's a huge diversity, not just local and international, but what type of research they are monitoring and approving, and whether they are situated for an institution or a research performing organization or a research funding organization. They can have very different structure of responsibility. So oversight bodies can rapidly proliferate to include multiple RECs overseeing a multi-center trial, multiple access bodies, and RECs governing data users. To facilitate availability is best if access oversight of many data sets is delegated to a single competent data access committee. So this was one of the suggestions formulated by Thorogood and Croppers in their 2017 article, that would be a kind of solution for this coordination between the oversight bodies, but still on an international level, it can cause a lot of policy work to figure out how to harmonize the responsibility structures and governance structures of these different committees. So, as a conclusion, how to establish clear roles for RECs in data sharing. I would like to list 7 challenges. Currently, research ethics committees I think very few committees are facing the data sharing challenges. Some of them started to work out their procedures or updating their procedures. For example, this was the case in the WHO Research Ethics Committee, that we started to update our procedures and see how these new requirements of data sharing can be embedded in our everyday practices. So challenge number 1 is the diversity of research ethics committees. So research ethics committees are very diverse. They can be research funding organizations situated on research funding organizations, or research performing organizations in universities, for example, or academic institutions. RECs can be national, central, or institutional. RECs can be an international one versus local RECs. So it's very hard to think in all of these perspectives, because these different RECs, although usually they use very fundamental and common principles of research ethics, and sometimes they share the guidelines that they work. On the other hand, their rules of procedures and their responsibilities could be really different. So it's very hard to establish what are their roles in this specific question of responsible data sharing. The second challenge is coordination that I've mentioned in the slide before. So how to establish good coordination between relevant committees and oversight bodies, how to avoid redundancy of work, how to avoid redundancy for administrative burden on both researchers and other institutions. The third is the increasing complexity of informed consent forms, both for participants and RECs. As we saw, a lot of discussions related to the role of research ethics committees are focusing on updating consent forms and adding extra elements and extra dimensions on these consent forms. But consent forms, some of them are already very complex. And it's very complex for participants. Usually, consent forms should enable participants to make a voluntary and enlightened decision on a specific issue. And sometimes the lengths of consent forms are not really supportive in this. And the complexity of consent forms makes a huge burden on research ethics committees also, because they have to assess those documents. And if they reach an extra level of complexity, that work could be much more challenging. The fourth challenge, the task of RECs without resources. So probably newly skilled people would be needed for research ethics committees, and this or existing people should be trained on how to assess data sharing plans, what is anonymization means, what these new data terminologies are, how to use this new language, and so on. Challenge number 6 is qualitative research, interviews, and ethnographic studies. Most of the discussion we're focusing on clinical trials, clinical data, and genetic data. But a lot of health science research using qualitative methods and ethnographic studies and interviews, for example. And in these cases, it's much, much harder to mitigate privacy risks embedded in these proposals. And there's very few discussion whether, for example, and how these studies could be made useful in this way. And challenge number 7 the specific task in continuing review of studies and project closures. Most of the discussion is focusing on protocol design for research ethics committees. So how to design a protocol that fulfills the requirements of research ethics committees. But research ethics committees are not just assessing these new protocols, but also monitoring these activities. So during continuing review of existing studies, there would be a huge burden on these committees how to evaluate the data sharing components of the study, and not just the burden, but how to do this and what would be the good procedures. So these are the challenges that I see ahead, and I'm looking for your questions. Thank you for listening, and here were my major references.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Any questions in-house in the participants? I don't see any questions online. Okay, I think while people, oh yes, our friend from the University of Toronto has a question, and I'm surprised.
Thank you. Thanks very much for a very thorough presentation. And you've laid out very nicely in the last slide the challenges faced with our research. Can you hear me all right?
I'm sorry, but I cannot hear the question. Could you change the microphone or?
I will. Is that better now? Or
maybe try this.
Or if you stay here, I think the solution is better. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Don Willison with the University of Toronto.
See if you can hear you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. You present very well the challenges at the end of doing all of this, including coordination activities. When it came to the issue of data sharing and data management plans, you suggested that the REB's role, one of the possibilities is making sure that there is a plan at the outset. The one challenge I would raise in that is, how do we avoid what happened in the United States when companies had to put out their privacy policies in order to comply with privacy regulations? And all that meant was post whatever you do, and there's no regulation of it in terms of the content, just the fact that you've done it. And it might be 15 pages of legalese, but you've done it, and you've satisfied your obligation. Now, it's a huge jump to say you have to do this, that, and the other. We don't want to over-regulate, but there has to be something more than a floor of you have a plan. Because that you have a plan could mean, I'm going to sell this to everybody under the sun. And because you've said that, you've satisfied the conditions. You know what I mean? It has to be, someone has to say, well, I don't like your plan because X, Y, and Z. There are equity issues, there are exploitation issues, and so on. And I think the REB role has to include something of that. Now, that makes it complicated because we don't have any consensus on that. Any thoughts?
Absolutely. I take it as a comment, not as a question. I absolutely agree. This is a extra level of a challenge to evaluate, and on what grounds to evaluate data management plans.
Thank you.
Is it on? No. Peter, thanks very much. I'm actually speaking next. My name's, I think that's coming up. My name's Doug Manuel. I'm here in Ottawa. I'm interested to hear your perspective from Europe. It's interesting to suggest that this should go through research ethics committees. And I can see you made a compelling argument for that, saying that a lot of this is ethics, both patient consent and others. But also hearing from research ethics boards or committees that they're getting beat up a lot. Everything is being put onto them. and things that aren't research ethics, like data management. And I think in part because they're the one time that you can catch everything, for research projects. You have to get research ethics, everyone agrees for that. And so there's a big long checklist. Have the investigators done this, that, and the other thing, including potentially data management. And so I'm interested, and I'm hearing the research ethics boards and committees expressing concern about that in two ways. One is they're just becoming the bad guys. They're becoming the big block to get your project done. And the other is that they're not capable. They don't have the expertise in things like data management. They may have the ethics for that, but not the technical parts, building on what I just heard. So any comments like what the flavor is in Europe with that regard, or any reflections on what I was just said?
Yeah. Okay, thanks for asking to represent European voices. I had some discussions, a member of the European Network of Research Ethics Committee, which is an association or organization of a professional organization. Usually we are meeting a few times a year, where most European member states are represented, and we discuss these issues. And most Research Ethics Committee members are not really supportive regarding open science from a Research Ethics Committee perspective. One is that Research Ethics Committees get used to the idea that the research data, personal data, are deleted after the project is finishes. So if a project finished, then you should delete the personal data. This is at the end of the study, when research participants are no more connected to the research activities. So they're in this type of very long data storage, where there is no limits to data storage, and they can say how long the data will be stored. Usually they feel that the privacy mitigation cannot be established properly, because if the more you store data that contains some identifiers, the more there is a risk for breaching the privacy of the data. So usually they're not really favorable with these trends. On the other hand, there are some people who are really supporting it because of transparency. They see that in the new world of science, of research and publication, this transparency component that will be established via open science gives and supports the traditional mission of research committees also. So that's why they see a kind of good compromise in supporting these or doing this. On the other hand, absolutely agree with your comment that most of them are not skilled in evaluating data-related issues. Both the terminology and both the technical complexity of these issues, they feel that they are not trained enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I wanted to ask you perhaps for some practical advice. I think we probably are getting a message from you and from others that perhaps research ethics boards are not particularly skilled in issues around assessing data sharing. Is there a recommendation that, or about training that we could recommend to ethics boards? Should we divert away from ethics boards to the more recent data access committees?
I think sometimes very basic trainings related to identifiers. So in this new digital and interconnected and database intensive environment, how identifiers work and how anonymization is working, and how a data repository is working, because most of them are not familiar with these concepts. And I think data repositories are kind of, or how these huge databases are working and how their procedures are granting privacy, for example, they not really see how these work. So probably these institutions and the procedures and the terminology would be really useful for them, I guess.
Okay, thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time for this particular session. And I want to thank you. It's obviously way past regular work hours for you, and much appreciated for the time, for the presentation and the discussion. So a hand of applause to you, and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you. Have a nice day. You too.
Thank you. So for those of you who are online, we're going to